Greetings. Title of the presentation is Rivers in the Ocean. It's actually Ben Franklin's term for something that he observed and tried to show on maps. The presentation is about how trying to build a mental model of a circulation system can help us explain a whole lot of separate facts that might otherwise be a lot harder to remember. So here's a globe viewed from an angle that lets you focus on the North Atlantic Ocean and the continents that are around it: North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. The orange square marks the location of the Cape Verde Islands. These were a very important stopping place for sailing ships. And the reason that they were so important, place to get water, place to stock up with food, place for sick sailors to get off until you bring in a couple new sailors to help you out. The reason it was so important is that it's just 15 degrees of latitude away from the equator. And as a result, the wind blows from the east or the northeast almost all of the time. If you've ever traveled to Hawaii, you can see the same thing because Hawaii is about that same latitude. You can stand where I am right now to take this picture. It's a dry desert hill, part of a volcano near the coast. And I can take a picture and look up at the top of the mountains. And I lived out there for 6 months and I saw the top of the mountain only 4 times. And the reason is it's almost a permanent rain cloud up there. It gets about 12 inches of rain where I'm standing. Where our apartment was about 25 inches of rain. A little further up that valley, they get 75 inches of rain. Up near the mountaintop, it's 150. And on the other side of the mountain, where the trade winds are coming from the ocean, nearly every day of the year, they get more than 200 inches of rain. These trade winds blowing from the east, about 15 degrees of north latitude, that's great news if you want to go west on a sailing ship. It is terrible news if you think the world is flat and has a edge out on the west, and you're going to fall off that edge. To make things worse, the wind from the east pushes ocean water toward the west, so even if you pulled your sails down, the ocean currents would still push you further west. By the way, that helps explain why we got a lot of hurricanes near Florida and not as many over by Europe. As this water is pushed across the ocean, it gets warmer because it's flowing close to the equator. The sun's really high in the sky. And it piles up around the Caribbean islands there. That water's got to go someplace, and a lot of it escapes by flowing north along the coast. That becomes the Gulf Stream, and when it gets up about the latitude of the Great Lakes, where the winds are blowing more often from the west, the winds will push that water back across the ocean. And to finish the circle, some of that water flows south along the coast of Africa to replace the water that was pushed west. So you got this nice big circle. It's called a gyre, a big circular flow, and it can carry ships to the Americas and back to Europe. Oh, and Benjamin Franklin drew the very first maps of this circulation. He interviewed a couple dozen ship captains about how fast they went across the ocean and what direction the wind was blowing from, and he made this map. That's got a little bitty map up in the corner that shows the complete circulation. And then the part he was especially interested in, that's that warm current coming up along the east coast called the Gulf Stream. If he would have had access to a satellite, a modern map shows the water temperatures in the Gulf Stream. And you can see that reddish warm water getting pushed northward up where it collides with the blue water off the coast of Canada, makes for great fishing grounds. Let's go back a couple hundred years and see how this worked during the era of colonial trade. A ship from France or Britain or Spain would go south until they got to about the latitude of the Cape Verde Islands, and then they would turn west, and the winds would blow them across the ocean literally in just a couple weeks. They'd land on one of these little islands or the north coast of South America. And then when you got all full of gold and things like that, they would load up, sugar from the plantations there, and they would head north on the Gulf Stream, which would carry them all the way across the ocean and back to England. Or, from the British point of view, this is like an automatic gold delivery system. The Spanish ships would go to America, load up with gold, and then when they were coming back, they would have to sail close to England, and England would just kind of, zip out there real quick for a couple hundred miles and take the gold away. And it finally irritated the Spaniards so much that they sent the Armada north. Oh, well, that's a great big historical story. The circular flow, though, is easy to understand, but it hides a secret in the deep ocean. And that secret is kind of important. If you take a look at this map, the Gulf Stream is carrying a lot more water north than the South Current is carrying near Africa. And the answer there is that some of that water sinks downward and it becomes a southward flow near the ocean bottom. This is what scares some climatologists because they think that this deep water flow can change quite suddenly as a result of global warming. And when we're causing the climate to change by human action, it could trigger something that could happen in just a couple of years. It's a really complicated story, but it illustrates an important fact. Climate change is not just about temperature. It's also about things like ocean currents and winds. And that's another story somewhere, but it's a part of the story of ocean currents too. The circular flow of ocean waters is one of these powerful ideas that can help us understand many other facts. And I'm going to throw you up a list of these facts, and you can take a map and check them out. Sailors at first were very afraid to go south around Africa because they didn't want to get so far that they would get pushed off to the west. Or actually, they might have gotten that far, got pushed west, couldn't get back home, and died. A lot of ships disappeared until people invented better sailing ships, the ones that could sail against the wind. It explains why Columbus landed on a Caribbean island instead of hitting mainland North America. It explains why every European country wanted a colony on the north shore of South America. If you go down there, you've got these little bitty countries, Suriname, the Dutch colony, and Guinea, the British colony, and French Guiana, the French colony, and the Brazilian Portuguese colony. And anyway, that's where they would land, and they could resupply. The circulation explains why beaches are a lot warmer in Florida than they are in Morocco or California, because the Gulf Stream is moving this warm water north. It explains why millions of people live in northern Europe, but very few live in northern Canada. It explains why Spanish gold ships were such tempting targets for the British. It explains why the Armada wound up in trouble because it got pushed into the English Channel and couldn't escape, couldn't come back out, had to go north. It explains why most people in the United States speak English, not Spanish. It explains why the Northwest Africa coast is a desert, because the cold water offshore makes the air cooler and drier. It explains why hurricanes are common around Miami and in Puerto Rico and Cuba. It explains why fishing is good near Newfoundland. It explains why icebergs tend to drift east toward Europe and knock down ships like the Titanic. And it explains why changes in those ocean currents could be a very serious risk as a consequence of global warming. In other words, we've got a dozen separate facts that you can understand rather than try to memorize all of these separate facts. It's much more useful to try to understand the system and to see how the facts are logical consequences of a single basic process. A lot of wind gets pushed across the ocean at 15 degrees north latitude and comes back toward Europe at 45 degrees. So we've got student activities, several of them with different focus and different levels of difficulty. And this PowerPoint can all be downloaded from the Giants website.